We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Kshama Sawant. Kshama Sawant is an economics teacher at Seattle Central Community College and a member of the American Federation of Teachers, Local 1789. In 2012, she ran for the Washington State Legislature in the 43rd District against Democratic incumbent Frank Chopp and received 29% of the vote. She is here to talk about her candidacy for Seattle City Council Position 2, the position currently held by Richard Conlon. Kshama, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again this morning.
Thank you for having me again, Mike.
So start out, if you would, before you go into why you are running, tell us a bit about the party affiliation that you are part of, Socialist Alternative.
Right, and I can start by adding a few things about myself as well. As you said, yes, I'm a teacher of economics and I'm a union member. And I'm also an immigrant from India. And my undergraduate background was in engineering, and I got into economics because, I was thinking about, questions about economic inequality. And those are the same questions that are propelling our campaign as well. And this campaign is being organized by Socialist Alternative that I'm a member of. Socialist Alternative is a nationwide organization of social and economic justice activists. And just to give you a bit of a background on who we are and what we do, we were, one of the forces that organized for the anti-WTO protests in Seattle in 1999. And we were also part of a coalition called Youth Against War and Racism during the first Iraq War, during the anti-war movement. And we've also been part of the Occupy Seattle movement. We were quite integral to the movement, and I personally was involved in that. And one of the key events that happened with the Occupy was, the encampment moving to the campus of Seattle Central Community College, my place of work. And I have to mention that my union played an exemplary role at that time, standing up for the occupation or for the Occupy movement, standing up for the activists, and saying that, yes, they had every right to come there. And so I think that's a really wonderful example of how different people from the left, different organizations from the left can come and work together on a common goal.
All right. And Socialist Alternative has international roots as well.
Yes, we are also affiliated with an international organization called the CWI, which is the Committee for Workers International. We have our sister organizations in over 45 different countries. We are based in countries like Nigeria, South Africa, my home country, India, Pakistan, Russia, many countries in Europe. The Socialist Party of Ireland is our sister organization, and through that, we have a member in the Irish Parliament, and we also have a member in the European Parliament. We also have our organization in South Africa. It's called the Democratic Socialist Movement. They have been activists for decades in South Africa, and they are, they're working shoulder to shoulder with the miners. And especially since the Marikana massacre, there have been really interesting developments there. They've launched a broad left party called the Workers and Socialist Party there, which is a really great example of what we need here. We need a mass political alternative to the two big business party system that we have here. And as far as Socialist Alternative in the U.S. is concerned, we also have really dynamic branches in cities like Minneapolis, New York City, Boston, and some of our newest branches are in the South, in Mobile, Alabama, and Tampa Bay, Florida. And we're also running another candidate for City Council in Minneapolis, Ty Moore, who has been an activist in the Occupy Homes campaign, against foreclosures and evictions.
All right. So you previously ran for state legislature. Why are you running for Seattle City Council?
So the issues that we are raising and the reasons we are running are, fundamentally are the same. And, we are in a state which has the dubious distinction of having the most regressive tax system in the entire nation. We're also seeing the broad impacts of the recession that we see everywhere in the country. So since 2008, the 1% has become wealthier than it was. Corporations are making historically high profits, and people, ordinary working people are left to deal with the consequences of unemployment, the proliferation of low-wage jobs, especially since the recession, cutting of social programs, cutting of funding for education. And so when we ran for State House last year, actually, we were calling for $15 an hour minimum wage statewide. In fact, we were one of the first people to talk about $15 an hour early last year. And it's interesting to see how that that demand has its own momentum through other forces. Fast food workers all over the country are saying we need $15 an hour and the right to unionize without retaliation. New York City fast food workers sort of led the way when they walked out on a one-day strike. And our campaign this year it has been launched because as everybody realizes, Seattle has become an unaffordable place. And it's becoming increasingly unaffordable for the vast majority of people. And the city government, for the most part, is out of touch with the needs of people. So if you look at the need for $15 an hour, the need to address the need for affordable housing. Affordable housing is in a huge crisis in this city, and rents are skyrocketing. We need to address the question of police brutality and excessive use of force by the police. So there's any number of issues that are burning issues as far as people's real lives are concerned. Especially if you think about the racial and income segregation and how people of color, immigrant groups are being pushed to the further and further periphery of the city because they're not able to afford housing within the city. These are issues that need to be urgently addressed, but aren't being addressed for the most part by the city government. And it's also important to point out that Richard Conlon has he's been one of the most energetic promoters of the interests of big real estate investors, like Paul Allen's Vulcan and other major investors, and he's been very lacking in his support for ordinary working people's interests, and that's why if you look at how the South Lake Union rezoning happened and how much people like Council Member Nick Licata were arguing for better advocacy for affordable housing, that did not happen. And that's a really good example to show the people of Seattle that even one more progressive voice on the city council can completely change the tenor of the debate, which is what we need at this moment, and that hasn't happened yet. And Richard Conlon also was the only council member who voted against paid sick leave for Seattle's workers. So I think we urgently need better advocacy for the interests of working people, for the youth, the elderly, the disabled. I mean, a lot of these people are completely shut out of the political debate. And when you talk about housing, it's not just young people. Elderly residents of apartments in Ballard, for example, have recently formed a tenants union because they are having to struggle against the possibility of being evicted because they won't be able to afford the new rents in the name of renovation. Who is going to represent these people? Most of us don't have a voice in city government, and the city council members are paid $120,000 a year. That is second only to the city of Los Angeles. And so the question to us as voters and as citizens is, do you think that the City Council of Seattle is doing the second best job in the entire country? And if not, then it's time for change. And in fact, the King 5 poll says it all. I mean, the recent poll shows that 45% of people are dissatisfied with the city council, and 54% of people who consider themselves independent politically think that the city council is not doing a good job. And if you look at nationally, the national polls are showing that over 60% of the people say that neither of the two big business parties is working for them, and we need a third party alternative. And so that all of this is, gain all of these ideas of the need for a political alternative for working people, for the need to address these urgent issues on city council. All of these are gaining momentum. And the resounding echo that our campaign has got from the people of Seattle is clear evidence that people are hungry for a real debate. People really want somebody to actually talk about real issues as opposed to mudslinging about, personal things on, each other's opponents. And it's really one of the most interesting things that's happened is that, we were calling for $15 an hour since last year. Now, fast food workers are also calling for it. And the fast food movement in Seattle, actually, led by the Good Jobs campaign and many different labor unions who are doing amazing work organizing fast food workers, they have now become prominent nationally. I mean, there have been articles written about Seattle's fast food workers movement, and the combination of our campaign being out there and being an unapologetic advocate for $15 an hour and other issues that are important to working people, and the fast food workers movement themselves, both together have put so much pressure on the electoral year this year that both the mayoral candidates are talking about $15 an hour. And I think that's a great live example of how you can completely alter the debate with grassroots momentum.
Has your opponent signed on to the $15 an hour yet?
No, actually, in one of the earliest candidate forums, he stood next to me and said he does not support $15 an hour.
All right. You were talking about the rent increases in Ballard. I believe I read that they're looking at, like, in a couple of the buildings there, they're looking at like a 200% increase. Is that right?
Yes. In some of the cases, I mean, they're not the most usual cases, but yes, in some of the cases, it's been 100%, 200%. And what's happening here, I mean, if you look at specifically the question of the elderly tenants that you're talking about, they're living in units right now. And, you know, they're elderly, meaning they're living on fixed income. This is inhuman to say that, you know, elderly people should now be paying 50%, 100%, 200% more rent, all in the name of renovation. And so, you know, the question is, why do these developers want to renovate these buildings? Why not just let the people live there? Or why not renovate by closing corporate tax loopholes and taxing big business and creating revenue for the city to make sure that housing is of good quality? We completely support good quality, environmentally sustainable, and livable housing. Of course, that is everybody's human right. But you can't provide, you can't say that you're providing that by evicting the very people who need that housing. And so the reality is that this is one city, Seattle is one city, but it's as though there are two cities, one city for the wealthy and the, millionaires and the upper income people, and the other city for the rest of us. And what's happening in the housing market is a good example of how the market functions often, where if there are very high income consumers in the market, then the market starts catering to them. And so you see the prices of these rental units, as you said, going up in almost astronomically, exponentially. That is not, people say, well, that's just the market. But, as an economist, I also always say, yes, that is the market, but that is the problem. That is how the market functions. When you say demand, it's not just the desire to buy a good, it's also the ability to buy a good. And the market is going to adjust itself to the highest ability bidders. And the rest of us are going to be left behind. And so you can either accept that state of affairs and say, well, that's the market, that's just an act of God, or you can do something about it. And in order to do something about it, we will need people to get involved in movements and pressure the city government into passing measures that can address them. And we have put forward a whole gamut of proposals which, have been on the table not on the table in City Hall, but have been around, proposed by housing advocates. I mean, one of the things I've been doing during the campaign is engaging with a lot of low-income housing advocates to see what are the solutions they have been bringing up to address the crisis of affordable housing. And they've talked about many different solutions. I mean, you can come up with a comprehensive solution. You can talk about development impact fees, inclusionary zoning, much higher in lieu of fees. There's any number of things that can be done which are fully well within the legal purview of the city council. And comparable cities to Seattle, including neighboring cities like Shoreline, are taking the leadership on that. The question is, why is that not happening in Seattle? And the reason it's not happening in Seattle is because most of the city council, barring a few voices who, are on our side, are really advocating for the big business investors. And they win the day because money talks. And that's why we have to have our own voices to argue against that and discuss these solutions and actually put them in place. Because, today people need housing. We've also talked to a lot of immigrant communities in Seattle and people of color communities who live very north or, very south, on the peripheries of the city. And they talk about skyrocketing rent too. I mean, that's another thing. People often think that maybe it's maybe just in the core city, like, if you're living in Capitol Hill, then of course you're going to face skyrocketing rent. So it's your own fault. Why don't you just move to West Seattle? Actually, I was talking to a reporter yesterday who was interviewing me, and he said he lives in West Seattle because he can't live in Capitol Hill. But even that is too high for him. So rents are high everywhere. And we have to remember that people who live, more near the periphery of the city are also lower wage workers. They tend to be people of color. They tend to be, lower wage getters. And so even if their rents are, in dollar terms lower than in Capitol Hill, proportionate to their income, it's too high. And so everywhere in the city, you see a crisis of affordable housing, and the vast majority of people are going to want solutions to that. And that has been, we've had almost a unanimous response to our campaign from people who are facing the need for affordable housing. And I also wanted to clarify that, another thing people talk about is, well, in order to address affordable housing, we need supply. We've had a lot of people telling us, well, we just need to build more units. And no doubt there is a need to build more units. Of course, we are not saying that the building of housing or construction of new units has to stagnate. But the reality is that there's 30,000 units going up, and very little of it is accessible to people, given what their paycheck is and their needs of their families. And so it's not simply a question of supply, it's a question of supply of affordable housing. And that is the key. And that is where we do need a public mandate to make sure that there is affordable housing.
So is that mandate rent control? And how would you address that the state won't permit rent control?
Right. So as far as the mandate is concerned, we need a comprehensive set of solutions. And so all the things that I mentioned, development impact fees, inclusionary zoning, higher in lieu of fees, these all have to be mandated. The city has to pass laws on that and say that, yes, we are going to do this. And like I said, many comparable cities are doing that, and there's no excuse for that not being done in Seattle, other than the fact that we have a city council that primarily serves real estate investors. But yes, we've also been talking about rent control, and I want to say I've had a tremendous response from people. The only people who are against rent control are big real estate investors, and people like Richard Conlon, who don't want to enact laws that are in the interests of the vast majority of people. And as far as the state law is concerned, yes, rent control was attempted I think a decade and a half ago, and the state legislature responded to that by passing a law that basically outlaws any municipalities from passing rent control locally. But my response to that is, well, if we used that approach, of being intimidated by unjust laws, then marriage equality would never have happened. Legalization of medical marijuana would never have happened. The Civil Rights Act would never have happened. Civil rights activists didn't say, well, it's illegal for black people to go through the front door of a restaurant or use the same water fountain, so we just have to accept it. No, they fought against it. And so when we're facing a huge crisis of housing, and this is not just in Seattle, we've got a lot of positive feedback from many other cities in Washington state who say, well, why isn't somebody, I can't tell you how many people have told me, why aren't you running in Spokane? Why aren't you running here? Why aren't you running there? And our response to that is, well, that means we clearly need more people stepping up to the challenge, and we need movements everywhere in order to challenge unjust laws. But I want to say, on this issue, not only do we need, that's the real leadership where you're going to challenge the status quo of injustice and really go out on a limb and say, no, I don't support this unjust law and I'm going to help change it. The reality is that, if you look at social change in the past, what it indicates is that if Seattle were to do this, then many other cities would also want to do it, because everybody is facing the crunch of high rents, and so everybody wants this. It's a question of who will take the initiative, and why should Seattle lag behind? We can do this. This is an extremely progressive city. That progressive opinion is not being reflected on the city council. It's about time that our real opinions were reflected by our elected officials, and that's why this campaign is so important, because it can be a harbinger of change. And as far as law is concerned, Richard Conlon has often said that I don't support rent control because it's against the law, and it's just he finds it ludicrous, that discussion even to have that. But I want to remind people that Richard Conlon was the guy who pushed for the environmentally destructive tunnel, which most people were against. Most of the environmental groups who on paper are endorsing him are extremely angry, and their rank and file are really voting for our campaign. They're extremely angry about it. He pushed for it. He called it the green alternative, which is, sort of Orwellian, for him to call an environmentally regressive mega project a green alternative. And he really, really took a very strong initiative on that. And one of the things he did when the people of Seattle were trying to put the issue of the tunnel on for a public referendum, he took them to court. He sued the people of Seattle to, against their right for a referendum. And, the court threw that case out. But what does this illustrate? What is the take-home lesson from this? The lesson is that he is willing to go to court in defiance of democratic rights of the voters of Seattle, but he's not willing to go to court to defend or fight for something that will actually improve greatly the standards of living of the vast majority of people. And I think if we are voting consciously, then we have to say, no, it's enough. You've had 16 years. We see your record. It's time for change, and it's time to have grassroots voices in City Hall.
All right. About 8 minutes left. Talk about transportation and what you would do to deal with that.
So, transportation, when we talk about transportation, there are two key questions that come up. One is that of environmental sustainability and reducing the carbon footprint. And the other is what I call transit justice. I think that when we talk about transit, we often miss the point about how inequitable transit provision is at this moment. And so we need to talk about both those things. And both those things can be addressed very effectively if Seattle were to have a world-class mass transit system. And a big, big part of that is going to be a fully funded and greatly expanded metro bus service, because this is what people depend on. And we are, of course, in support of light rail. There is no question about it. I grew up in a city with trains, in Mumbai, and every time, all through my college years and my early work years, I used the train, and I love that. But the reality is that the way the light rail has been set up right now, first of all, it's inadequate in the sense of the fact that it's not serving entire communities in the South. Entire neighborhoods in the South are either underserviced or not serviced at all by transit. And so when we talk about transit dollars, it's a question of who gets to benefit from those transit dollars. If we are providing new transit options to communities that are already having other transit options, who are well off and can afford other options, then that's not what's an effective use of transit dollars. We need to see how are we going to provide bus service such that somebody who lives in South Park or Georgetown or Del Ridge or Rainier Beach can actually use the bus service as a viable mode of transport. See, that's another question. Imagine, a mom whose day consists of making lunch for her kids, sending them off to school, going to work, maybe in downtown, maybe housekeeping staff at one of the Hyatts, and then she, after her day's work, she has to go pick up groceries, take her kids, back home. For this day to be viable, she needs viable transit options, which means that she cannot be stuck in bus, getting one transfer to another, being stuck, having to get several transfers and spending several hours of her day just getting from one place to another. That's not a viable option. And we can provide really good transit options. The problem is that nobody is really advocating for it because, it's a question of funding. And routes are not being expanded, but they're being cut. And a lot of the elderly and disabled population is also marginalized because of this, because how are you supposed to get from one place to another? And I just want to give you one quick example. There's in Beacon Hill, 2 light rail stations were set up, and the Filipino Community Center is right in the middle. And that community center services a lot of the elderly Filipino community, and they relied on a bus route that existed at that time. But when these light rail stations came up, that bus route was eliminated. But that's a problem for them because both the light rail stations are situated 1.5 miles from where the community center exists. And so for elderly people who have mobility issues, that's not a real option. And so we need to urgently talk about expanding bus service. And clearly the central issue is funding. Metro is facing 17% cuts, and you see this royal passing of the buck. City officials say, well, we can't do anything. County has to do it. County says, well, we can't do anything. The state has to do something about it. We need an end to this passing of the buck and say, no, right here, we're going to solve this problem. And one of the things our campaign is recommending is that we tax people who make more than $1 million a year, even at a modest rate, and create a permanent funding for mass transit and some funding for education.
So that would be taxing people who live within Seattle.
Yes, I mean, if we're doing it in City Council, it will be taxing people within Seattle, but there's nothing to stop people in King County from emulating that and doing that same thing at the county level, and nothing to stop people in the state from doing that. And so Seattle can lead the way.
And how would you work with neighborhoods in their decisions that they make?
Right. I mean, I think what's happened is that we've been talking to a lot of neighborhood councils and neighborhood activists, and many of them have said that their voice is actually not being heard in the last decade or so. There used to be, a culture where city officials, I mean, I don't know how much they responded, but at least they used to engage in those discussions. And even those discussions are not happening anymore. And neighborhood activists and community organizers are feeling shut out from the political discussion. And one of the reasons many of them are supporting our campaign is because they want that open dialogue. And we have that approach. We are saying that it's not a question of whether we agree or disagree from the get-go. It's a question of whether we can have an open dialogue and discussion. And, somebody was joking to me that, in an election year, the number of public engagements candidates do, spike up. And the next 4 years, it goes down to almost zero. And somebody else was saying, how many town hall meetings do city officials call for in a given year? And that's the point. The point is that if you have a grassroots voice like ours in the city council, it would be the exact opposite scenario. Our public engagements and town halls wouldn't go down to zero, but they would actually spike up, because a big part of if you're doing your job of representing the majority of people, if you're doing that in a sincere way, then it is you're absolutely required to engage public opinion. If you're serving them and you don't even talk to them, how are you going to know what they need? And so we absolutely need to really push for a greater public engagement. And I want to say in closing that primarily the voices that are shut out are women, people of color, immigrant communities, low-income people, homeless people. We need strong advocacy for marginalized communities and oppressed communities. And that is something that we will be really highlighting if we are on City Council.
Okay, about a minute. What methodologies beyond town halls would you use for communicating with these people? So
I'll use $15 an hour as an example. I've said that, as a city council member, my first order of business would be to discuss an ordinance on $15 an hour citywide. And so to carry out that process effectively, the very first step is to engage people. So we need different groups, nonprofit organizations, low-income advocacy groups, like Puget Sound Sage, like the Office of Civil Rights. We need all of them to come together in a coalition for a discussion and for a series of meetings to decide how are we going to do this. Let's look at the best approach. And that would be my first step, reaching out to people. And I've already mentioned to a lot of people that, hey, we should do this together and let's work on this. And that's something that would be the starting point.
All right. We're talking with Kshama Sawant. She is candidate for Seattle City Council Position 2. How can people find out more about your campaign?
They can go to www.votesawant.org. That is VOTESAWANT. You can also just Google my name and you'll find it. Or you can go on Facebook. It's facebook.com/votesawant. And that Facebook page will give you a lot of information. You can follow us on Twitter. And please get in touch with us. It's 10 days, I think, until election day, but it's every day, every single day is very important to us because we are still carrying out massive outreach. So if you feel inspired by any of what you've heard and you would like to help us, please contact us because we need help with outreach. And I would really appreciate anybody getting involved. And I want to say this is a volunteer-run campaign. We have over 300 volunteers working on it, so please join us.
All right. Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate it.